What the Allies didn't know was that the invasion through Holland and northern Belgium was not the main attack. The operation, Val Gelb, or Case Yellow, had two parts. The aim of the first part was to draw the best Allied units, including the BEF, north, which is exactly what happened. The second part was the main assault through an area the Allies were least expecting it, the Ardennes. There was an assumption that the Maginot Line and the steeply wooded hills and valleys of the Ardennes combined to form an impenetrable fortress. Consequently, the forces deployed in the border areas were weak. As the fighting in Holland progressed, nearly 46 divisions, including most of the Panzer divisions, were assembling in secrecy in the Ardennes. On May the 13th, they emerged from the forests. Their objective was to advance through France along the Somme Valley, isolating the British to the north and the bulk of the French army in the south. It was hoped that once surrounded on three sides and with their backs to the sea, the British would seek some sort of armistice. The way would then be clear for Germany to knock France out of the war. German operational tactics relied on highly mobile offensive units with balanced numbers of well-trained artillery, infantry, engineer and tank formations, all integrated into Panzer divisions. They relied on excellent communication systems, which enabled them to break into a position and exploit it before the enemy could react. Panzer divisions could carry out reconnaissance missions, advance to make contact, defend and attack vital positions or weak spots. This ground would then be held by infantry and artillery as pivot points for further attacks. Although their tanks were not designed for tank versus tank combat, they could take ground and draw the enemy armour onto the division's anti-tank lines. This conserved the tanks to achieve the next stage of the offensive. The unit's logistics was self-contained, allowing for 3 or 4 days of combat. The Panzer divisions would be supported by motorized and infantry divisions. The German communication system also enabled a degree of cooperation between land and air forces. Tactical air controllers were attached to the Panzer divisions, who could call up Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers to provide air support. Typically, it took them about an hour to arrive overhead during the Battle of France. The main opposition to the Germans' advance through the Ardennes came from Belgian motorized infantry and French mechanized cavalry divisions. However, they were unable to delay the Panzer's progress, and so withdrew back to the river Meuse. Arguably, a bigger obstacle was the poor road network through the forests and ravines. What routes there were became gridlocked due to the sheer number of vehicles trying to get through. The Panzer divisions had over 40,000 vehicles, and although these had been spotted by French reconnaissance flights right up to the night of May the 10th, they were discounted by intelligence officers on the assumption that these were likely to be secondary attacks to the one in Holland. In the northern part of the Ardennes, 7th Panzer Division, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, struggled to secure a bridgehead on the Meuse at Dinant. The French defenders had succeeded in blowing the bridges, and so improvised crossings had to be attempted under determined enemy fire. The river at this point is about 120 yards wide, which meant progress was slow. But the slow, ponderous communications of the French army were playing their part, and reinforcements simply did not arrive on time. Planned counterattacks were rescheduled and cancelled. By the morning of May the 14th, German tanks were occupying the heights looking down on the defenders. Rommel was across the Meuse. But the Germans' main objective lay further south. Sedan was regarded as the gateway into France. Capture this, and the route across the plains of northern France would be clear all the way to the coast. Defences at Sedan were weak and neglected. Half-hearted attempts had been made to reinforce the defences in the winter of 1939, but the cold weather prevented the concrete from setting properly. The works that were carried out were photographed by Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. To make matters worse, there were no mines, as most of the allocated stock had been used in defence of the Belgian border. The attack was to be led by General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps. Ideally, Guderian wanted his artillery to soften up the bunkers and gun emplacements, but they were still struggling to get through the traffic, backed up through the forests. But he did have the Luftwaffe. Over the next 3 days, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 4,000 sorties, more sorties than the world had yet seen. For the poorly trained defenders, this was morale-sapping warfare, and they were soon routed, allowing the Germans to consolidate their bridgehead. The inability of their commanders to make decisions only made matters worse, and any local advantages were soon squandered. By nightfall on May the 12th, Sedan had fallen with little sign of the defenders. The battle was now on to secure their bridgehead so that they could break out. French forces mounted repeated attacks. Although the French had 138 main battle tanks like the Char B-1, which was far more powerful than anything in the German armoury, they were unable to consolidate their positions due to the lack of infantry support. The capture of Sedan and the expansion of the bridgeheads alarmed the French, who called for a total effort against the bridgeheads at Sedan to isolate the 3 panzer divisions. General Gaston-Henri Billotte, commander of the 1st French Army Group, whose right flank pivoted on Sedan, urged that the bridges across the Meuse be destroyed by air attack, convinced, he said, that over them will pass either victory or defeat. On May the 14th, an RAF bomber force took off with a fighter escort to attack the bridges. The fighters were soon tied up in battles with German fighters, leaving the Fairey Battles and Bristol Blenheims to soldier on alone. But their targets were already heavily defended, and so the bombers had to run the gauntlet of heavy flak as they approached their targets. So heavy was the defensive fire that the Allied bombers could not concentrate over the target. Allied bomber pilots called it the hell along the Meuse. Out of 71 bombers dispatched, 40 to 44 bombers were lost, meaning a loss rate of 56 to 62%. The fighters fared little better. Greatly outnumbered, their losses were some 52%. While the French struggled to regain some semblance of balance, Guderian ordered the 10th Panzer and the Grossdeutschland infantry divisions to attack south to make the French think that they were going to outflank the Maginot Line and roll it up. To the south of Sedan lay the heavily fortified heights of Stonne. By capturing this area, the Germans were able to deny the French a vantage point that overlooked Sedan. Between the 15th and 17th of May, the town changed hands 17 times, finally in the Germans' favour. But by then, Guderian was already on the move northwestwards. Speed was of the essence, and in that cause he was prepared to ignore orders emanating from his senior commanders back in Berlin. The French defeat at Sedan left the Allied army groups in Belgium with sparse flank protection. The German advance through France was so rapid that many French soldiers were in such shock that they were taken prisoner before they could offer resistance. On May the 15th, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division encountered the French 1st Armoured Division, but rather than engage in a lengthy delaying battle, they simply drove through them and left the 5th Panzer Division to finish the job. By the next day, the French 1st Armoured Division had just 17 serviceable tanks. At the same time, Guderian's 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions broke out of their Sedan bridgehead. The French divisions were scattered and finding it difficult to form a coherent defence against the rapidly advancing German mobile units. But Hitler was unnerved by his panzer success and ordered them to halt so that they could be reinforced by the slower moving infantry divisions and their flanks strengthened. As a result, Guderian threatened to resign. But a compromise was reached which enabled him to carry on as a reconnaissance in force. By May the 18th, Guderian was on the move again. The next day, the French collapse on the Meuse was complete when General Giraud, commander of the 9th Army, was captured and his army surrendered en masse. Although the French expected the Germans to drive south and take Paris, they didn't. Their trajectory was towards the north coast of France. On May the 20th, units of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the Channel coast at Noyelles. They were now barely 80 miles away from the Channel ports. But their advance had stretched their supply lines to the point that they were extremely vulnerable to an Allied offensive. If successful, the Germans would be completely isolated. General Maxime Weygand was now overall commander of the Allied forces, although his plan of attack was much the same as his predecessors. A French force was to attack the corridor from the Somme Valley to the south, while a British force was to attack at Arras. The attack was codenamed Frankforce after its commander, Major General Franklin. It was supposed to be executed by 2 divisions in 2 columns, but in the end the attack was made by only 2 battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, supported by 58 tanks. These were machine-gun-armed Matilda 1s and 2-pounder-armed Matilda 2s of the 4th and 7th Battalions of the Royal Tank Regiment. The attack began on the 21st of May, and both columns initially made good progress, advancing up to 10 miles. The heavy armour of the Matilda 2s made them virtually impervious to German anti-tank weapons, their shells bouncing off the flanks with little effect. But the attack lacked any air support because of poor communications, as well as manpower to consolidate any gains. Rommel subsequently made a counterattack that evening and recovered the situation, but it had cost 7th Panzer Division heavy casualties. It was now clear to General Gort that France was all but lost, and that he must try and save the BEF. Planning for what became Operation Dynamo now began in earnest.